So a mother went to wake her son for church one Sunday morning, and when she knocked on the door, from the other side of the door, she heard her son say, "I'm not going." And to which she said, "Well, why not?" And he said, "I'll give you two good reasons. I don't like them, and they don't like me." To which her mom replied, "Well, I'll give you two good reasons why you will go to church this morning. One, you're 47 years old, and two, you're the pastor." Last week, if you were here, we sort of surfaced the question, why do we go to church at all? Why is this something, of all of the things we could be doing with our Sunday morning, and for most of us, the time when we're not working is very precious. It certainly times our most precious resource. Why do we do this thing called church? Why does the church matter? And we sort of just decided, let's camp out here for a few weeks and talk about this. And to answer this question, we sort of went back to the first couple chapters of the book of Acts, when Jesus started the church, when he sort of initiated it. And what we saw is that Jesus initiated the church with a mission. And the church's mission was to be his witnesses, was to sort of be the ones who would tell the story of Jesus, but not only the story, but all of the implications that come with the story. In that day, it was very much like our day today, where there are lots of people who don't know who Jesus is, who don't know what he came to do, what he accomplished. I mean, they may know a few facts about Jesus. They may know that we celebrate Jesus' birthday on Christmas, but they have no idea that not only can Jesus change your eternal destiny, but he can change your life in the here and now and fill your life with meaning and with purpose. And so Jesus gave the church that mission, to be his witnesses out in the world. In a way, we compared it last week, really we are all called to be what we think of when we think of missionaries. We're called to be missionaries, and this happens in sort of all of the ordinary things of life. So your child plays on a sports team. Well, you still go to your child's sporting events and you still cheer hard for them, but now you go with another mission and purpose in that. To get to know these other parents and to love and to serve them and to be ready in case spiritual conversations happen. We're still good neighbors, and yet now there's more purpose and intentionality into our neighbor relationships, to love and to take care of them and to initiate spiritual conversations. We take this into our workplaces. Now we're missionary nurses, and we're missionary engineers, and we're missionary teachers and plumbers. Now there's all this sort of intentionality and purpose infused in our work and in the relationships around our work. See how this sort of works its way out? In all of our own separate spheres, we're called to be Christ's missionaries, his witnesses. So it happens individually, but the church corporately also helps fulfill this mission in this very strange communal experience that we call church. In every age, in every culture that the church has existed, the church has looked sort of strange, especially when the church is healthy, when it's doing what it's supposed to do. It looks very strange, it looks a little bit bizarre, and yet it also looks a little attractive to people. And so the church itself, its communal life, is part of this missional purpose of God. And so last week we started sort of diving in, well, what does this communal life of the church actually look like? And we sort of honed in on that one circle called growing. How for each of us as believers, and especially as a corporate body, there is a growing, there is a learning aspect to our faith. When we trust Christ, when we sort of accept that good news, that announcement of what he's done on our behalf, that's the beginning. That sort of starts off the journey of the rest of our life, learning all the different ways that that gospel works itself out in our lives. And it affects everything. Every single sphere of our life, the gospel touches. And so lots of what we do when we're together is facilitate times for learning and for growing to happen. That was last week. If you missed it, you can go back and listen to it. This week, I want us to talk about the other circle there, the one called connecting. We're going to sort of focus in on that. And before we get to the passage that talks about what our connection should look like, I want to just share a picture with you that'll sort of help with today's, where we're going. So I have two bags here. I have one that's a bag of marbles, and one that's a bag of grapes. Now, these two bags in many ways are very similar, okay? They each are a collection of individual sort of entities. They're both roughly the same size. Each one is some sort of shade of green. And I think there's roughly, I didn't actually count, the same number of them in each of these bags. But that's about where the similarities between these two stop. You know, you take this bag of marbles, and each one of these marbles is completely distinct. They're very separate from one another. In fact, they move around quite a bit. They're very transient. There's a lot of slippage, or whatever you'd want to say. If you set this bag down and you pick it back up again, they've sort of shifted. Now they're all in different spots. Each marble that was touching the marbles around it is now being touched and touching different marbles. If there were a hole in this bag, it'd be very easy for one of them just to fall out, or many to fall out. That's this bag of marbles, whereas this bag of grapes is very different. They're connected by this sort of organic network that sort of ties these all together. You know, if I set this down and I pick it back up, they all stay in roughly the same spot. Each one of these grapes is sort of surrounded by the same 4 or 5 grapes all the time. If there were a hole in this bag, it still probably wouldn't fall out. In fact, there are holes in this bag. So that's the bag of grapes. Now, I'm sure you can kind of see where I'm going with this. The kind of relational connectedness that is called for in the New Testament for the church is supposed to be like this bag of grapes. And yet, the tendency for all of us and for the church at large is to become a lot more like this bag of marbles, where we're this collection of, you know, spiritually interested people who maybe share a common interest, but that's about it. And so we sort of bang into each other on a Sunday morning for an hour, and then we sort of go off our separate ways. And you know, this isn't just the church. This is sort of our culture as a whole. Pew Research Group did a poll, actually here in Fort Worth, of 19 to 29-year-olds. And they asked them this question. They asked, how many of you believe in God? And I was sort of surprised, especially that age range. 83% said, I believe in God. You know, 4 out of 5 people you talk to say, I believe in God. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the God of the Bible, but some sort of higher being. But then the next question they asked was, how many of you think it's important to, like, attend a religious service? And only 33% said that's important. So that 50% in the middle there, 50% of people are quite spiritual, but not religious. Which means they have their belief, but they don't want anything to connect them to anything or any other person. And that's a lot of times how we want to be too. Sometimes that feels a lot easier. That feels a lot safer. You know, we can show up, sort of have surface level type conversations, but we don't really need to do all the work it takes to be that kind of connected. That's sort of the tendency for all of us. And so this morning, I want us to look at a passage. There's lots of passages you could turn to on this topic, but a passage that really addresses the connectedness. What should it look like, our sort of interconnectedness? So if you would, open with me to Hebrews 10, verses 19 to 25. I think in this paragraph we're going to see a couple things. One, I think we're going to see the marks of genuine Christian community. You know, what sort of character traits does genuine Christian community have? I think we'll see that, but then even deeper, I think we'll see the source. You know, all these grapes, they had the same life energy source running through them. I don't know what you call it for grapes. I'm thinking of like sap, but I don't know if that's what you call it. But they all shared that same energy source. And so we'll see sort of what's the source of this kind of community. So let's first start with what does it look like, the marks, traits, and then we'll get to the source. So the second half of the paragraph covers these marks, verses 24 and 25. These are famous verses. You've heard them before, I'm sure. It says, and let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. So in these two verses, I saw four different characteristics of these great kind of communities. The first one's in those first four words, and let us consider. The church is supposed to be a community that considers one another. There's this intentional attentiveness, is how I said it, where we think about each other, where we notice what's going on with those around us. Now, I won't ask you to show your hands, but how many have been to sort of a counselor or a therapist or something like that? There's no shame in this. I've been to many, actually, and spent lots of time talking to counselors, and it's a fantastic experience. I would highly recommend it. But what do counselors do? When you're sitting in front of a counselor, what do? They ask questions, they listen. You might notice they're often taking notes. What are they doing? They're studying you. They're studying me. They're picking up on body language and all sorts of nonverbal cues, and they're listening to what you're saying. They're asking follow-up questions. They're intentionally attentive to you. And that's what the author of Hebrews is saying to the church. He's saying, stop and consider those around you. Study each other. Figure out through asking questions, through watching body language, how are the people around you doing? Become a community of consideration. And that's why I really like that we never turn the lights all the way down in here. I mean, a lot of churches do that. I guess to try to create this sort of me and Jesus experience, which is great. We should have lots of me and Jesus experiences, but I don't think that should happen necessarily here, because we're here to be with one another. This is corporate. We're here to see each other. So we can notice each other in this room. There's a lot of noticing that can happen even now when we're just sitting here. But then especially afterwards when we engage with one another and we ask questions, there's a lot of noticing that can happen. This is sort of the first and most basic characteristic of Christian community. This intentionally paying attention to one another. Now, as we go through these, just sort of ask yourself, all of these sort of beg for personal reflection. Does this describe me? Am I paying attention to those around me? Have I even noticed who's sitting near me? Do I care about their well-being? This is the first mark. And the second comes in the very next words. And let us consider how we may spur one another on. Now, depending what translation you have, anyone else have a different translation for that? Spur one another on? Provoke, stimulate, stir. I actually like provoke the best. That's the old King James version of this. This word's a farming word. And the picture is this farmer who has these oxen, like 1-ton animals, and they need to move them, and they can't. So the farmer takes a stick with a sharp point on the end, like a nail or something, and pokes these animals, provokes them. These animals who won't move, tries to get them moving, or maybe they're moving in the wrong direction and needs to correct them. I mean, that's the picture here. That's the idea. That genuine Christian community has this kind of provoking going on. Now, we don't like this, right? This sort of seems to violate our personal space. Like when someone does this to us, we're tempted to say, hey, don't tell me what to do. But we need this. You know how when you drive down the highway, you have those blind spots in your car? Like, we all have blind spots in our own lives. And if we're not careful, those blind spots could cause a lot of damage. We need people around us who can very easily spot our blind spots that we can't, to out of love and compassion actually speak to us and address them and bring them to our attention. You know, so a friend, may say, hey, I heard you talking on the phone to your mom. Do you always talk to your mom like that? You might say, yeah, that's sort of how we always do things. Isn't that normal? Say, no, that's not normal. Or maybe there's a close friend who's sort of always complaining about being broke, and yet they always are wearing brand new clothes, and you're like, something's, it's a blind spot. We need each other. That's sort of what I'm saying. We need another set of eyes to sort of address the areas in our life. And we're not going to have too many relationships sort of at this level, but just like the grapes, there's probably 4 or 5 people that can be around you at any one time that you can sort of intentionally say, hey, let's get real. Let's talk about what's really most important. Let's sort of get off the surface and talk about what really matters. Sort of what we're struggling with. We need people with eyes on us. Now, lest you think you have the spiritual gift of provoking, which, some people are better at that than others, I guess. This is tempered very much by the very next trait. Keep reading. It says, let us consider how we may spur one another on toward loving good deeds, not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing. We'll come back to that. But encouraging one another. So provoking and encouraging, these two really are both the same act of love. Provoking is this tough love that we need, and encouraging is this consoling, sympathetic, coming alongside, encouraging kind of love. Speaking courage into someone's life. We need both of these. And depending on how well you know yourself and your own personality, we're going to probably tend towards one or the other. But it's essential that for genuine Christian community that both of these are at play. Now, all of these first 3 traits sort of have a goal. They're all working towards something. All of this consideration, this provoking, this encouragement, they're all moving towards this others-centered lifestyle. Consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. Now, love, when we talk about it in English, it really loses a lot of meaning, because for us, love's a feeling, often, and love is something that we sort of fall into. But that's not what the author of Hebrews is saying here. He's not saying, I hope this community you're with just sort of happens to have these warm feelings for one another. No, love in Scripture is always a verb. It's always this action-oriented, sort of self-sacrificing kind of stance towards one another. It's a choice. And so that's the goal of this community, is that we'd be that attentive to one another. We'd be others-centered. Radically others-centered. We'd be giving to one another. And the way that works itself out in a community is you take care of those who are hurting. You take care of the poor, of the outcasts, of those who are going through a hard time. That's what this genuine Christian community looks like. Now here's the next question. How do we create that kind of community? How do we generate that? Or you can even get a little bit more personal with it. All of us want friends like that, right? We want those kind of people in our lives. I'd love for somebody to notice me and to be willing to speak into my life and to encourage me and to be other-centered towards me, right? But you could flip it. Are you that kind of friend to anybody else? My guess is, if we're honest, most of us would say we're not often that kind of a friend. I mean, sin runs real deep. The selfishness and sort of, our eyes are often on ourselves, aren't they? The truth is, we can't manufacture that kind of community. In our own sinfulness, we can't. But the answer to how we generate this kind of community comes in the beginning of this paragraph. Starting in verse 19, we see the source of genuine Christian community. So let's just read verses 19 to 23 and we'll talk about it. It says, therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain that is his body, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and with full assurance that faith brings, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience, and having our bodies washed with pure water, let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. That's sort of a hard paragraph to understand. The author of Hebrews is sort of assuming that we know the Old Testament like the back of our hands when he writes this paragraph. And the problem is, we don't, right? And so there's all these allusions to Old Testament things that just kind of go over our head, and we're not really sure what all this means. We probably get the general gist, but This passage is all about the temple. It's all about the presence of God. So I think as we remind ourselves of how that worked, this passage will really open itself up to us. You'll probably remember the temple sort of had these three different kind of nested courts. So there was this sort of outer court, and then inside of that there was a smaller one, and inside of that there was an even smaller one. And the outermost court was called the court of the Gentiles, and anybody could come in there. That was supposed to be a place for anybody to come and sort of seek God's presence. Now the next court was called the holy place. Now who's allowed inside the holy place? I mean, this was the priests. And then if you were Jewish and you brought your sacrifice, you would also be allowed to go back into the holy place because they would offer your sacrifice. So that's sort of the next sort of layer. And then inside of that was the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place as it's described in this passage. Now who's allowed inside of there? Yeah, just once a year, the high priest. And really only for one moment of that year. Because that's where they believed, and that's where God's presence resided. Now, obviously, God is spirit. He's the creator of all. His glory fills the whole earth. But in a very special way, God had his presence reside in that Holy of Holies. Now, God's presence is what we need most. Have you ever had this experience where you're sort of standing next to a mountain? Maybe in Colorado, maybe New Mexico, somewhere. And as you're standing next to that mountain, all of a sudden, all the problems you had in life, like, they're still there, but somehow they're a little bit smaller. They're like just in perspective of like when you're in the presence of this amazing mountain. Well, that's why we need God's presence. Because the mountain, that doesn't even compare. We need that experience of transcendence to sort of bring perspective to our experience. But what's really weird in this situation is what we need most, God's presence, we can't get to. It's guarded by this really thick curtain, and we can't get to it. If you had sort of this God meter, and you could sort of like sense where God's presence is. As you made your way into the temple, you would see that his presence is getting higher and higher until you got to this Holy of Holies, where that meter would sort of go Richter, and that's where God's presence resided. That's what we most need, and yet we can't get to it. There's this curtain. And so if you know, that's what Jesus' death's all about. And even as he died on the cross, as you know, that curtain symbolically was torn in two. Jesus dealt with all of our sin. He absorbed the punishment for all of that in his body on the cross. And so there's this new access, this new ability to come into God's presence that was never there before. And that's what these verses are getting at. Since we have confidence to enter that most holy place, and what's there? That's God's presence by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way opened through the curtain that is his body. The very presence of God is now accessible in a way like it's never been available before, and that's the source. That is the source of this kind of community. God's presence is the only thing that can take naturally sort of sinful, self-focused individuals and make them into a cluster of grapes, so that we're attentive to one another and we care enough about each other to speak into each other's lives, and we encourage each other, and we're always looking sort of outward, outside of ourselves. Only God's presence can do that. So here's my next question. So it's very clear in this Hebrews passage that we now have access to God's presence. So how do we access the access? God's presence is available to each and every one of us. Well, how do we experience it? And this passage has two sort of ideas in it. In verse 23, it says, "Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promises faithful." This is sort of a personal way to experience God's presence. You rehearse the gospel to yourself. You read, you pray, you have all these spiritual practices. That's how you access God's presence on an individual basis. But there's another way to access God's presence. Because the gospel, it's personal, but it's never private. And that's in verse 25. "Consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together." We access God's presence when we meet together. You know that verse where Jesus says, where 2 or 3 come together in my name, there am I with them. We don't understand all how this works, but when God's people are together, there is a special presence of God there in a way that's different than when we're by ourselves. It's one of the reasons we meet. One of the reasons we gather like this. It's hard to explain exactly how this happens. It happens in some ways that we'd expect, and it happens in other ways that we might not expect. We might expect when we meet like this to experience God's presence, say when we're worshiping and we're rehearsing these truths of God through song. We might expect to hear God's presence when we're hearing the word preached. But it happens in other ways too that we might not expect. Like you might be sitting over here, and as you're looking at the screen, you happen to notice someone over here, and you know their story. You know what they're going through. And yet you see them standing up, singing at the top of their lungs, truth that they're hanging on to, even though they're struggling. And so that sort of encourages you and makes you hold on a little tighter to your faith in what you're going through. That's one of the ways God's presence works in a very mysterious way when we're together. It might happen when afterwards, or maybe in some sort of class or group, where someone shares a prayer request. And so you pray for them, but as you're praying for them, God's Spirit kind of gives you an idea of something real tangible you could do to meet that need, or to just let them know that they're not carrying the weight of that prayer concern all by themselves, that you're sort of in this with them, and so you do something real tangible for them. I mean, that is God's presence reaching each of us. There's a reason Scripture calls us His body. We, in a way, enact His presence to one another when we're together. And the gospel is the only thing that can create this kind of community. I mean, the gospel is the only thing to address our deep-rooted selfishness and turn our eyes outward. And I just want to spend the last couple minutes talking about how does the gospel actually do that. I read a really interesting C.S. Lewis article this week called The Inner Ring. Has anyone ever read The Inner Ring? I've never seen it before. He begins by sort of talking about our fundamental drives in life. What are the most basics, the most, things we want most? Freud would say, it's sex. That's the most basic human drive. Karl Marx would say, no, it's not that. It's money and status. But C.S. Lewis says, no, those things aren't the most basic, the most fundamental. What he says, and I think he's right, is that the most basic drive is to be known. To be known by another person and to know another person. But not only that, to be accepted and even admired or validated. That's our deepest longing. We were created like that. We were created these relational beings, and yet very quickly sin came into the picture, which sort of skewed everything. And we're these like relational black holes, and relationally things have gotten really complicated. And so what C.S. Lewis talks about is how in our relationships, even our friendships, there's this sort of sinful sort of self-promotion even in our friendships. And we may enjoy our friends, but a lot of times the people we have around us, we also sort of get something out of it. We either get a little bit of status, we get some popularity from that person, there's a reputation, maybe an entrance into a certain network of people over there. And so he talks about how the world operates as these sort of networks of friendships, these rings. And all of us are sort of on this quest for moving to that next ring. There's that group of people we really want to get in with. And he gives a great example of, if you've probably had this experience happen to you, you're talking to somebody at a party or maybe at church here, and you're both engaged in this conversation, and all of a sudden someone walks by, and all of a sudden that person you were engaged with is no longer really listening to you. I mean, they're still talking to you, but they're no longer listening. Now you can tell they're sort of engaged somewhere else, and pretty soon they sort of just drop you completely. Have you ever had that experience? Have you ever done that to someone else? My guess is we all have, and that's because there's someone else who we sort of want to be in their ring. And they just walk by, and that's more important. This is one of our deeper drives. And so what he says, he's got a really powerful line at the end of this essay. He says, the quest for the inner ring will break your heart unless you figure out how to break the hold the inner ring has on your life. And the only way to break it is through the gospel. Because the truth of the gospel is that you and I are standing in the most center inner ring that exists in the universe. God has invited us into that inner ring, and now we're at a place of security there. And we can just sort of rest. And because we don't need to strive and manipulate and sort of kind of be on that quest anymore, now we can turn and give ourselves to other people. You know, our church is going to be one of these. Our church is currently one of these, and we're tending towards one of these. And I mean, that's just the reality. All churches, all groups are. Are we a bunch of individuals who sort of share a common faith, interest in Jesus, but that's sort of where the connections stop? Or do we literally share the same life source? The same gospel that motivates and empowers and turns your eyes outwards, turns my eyes outwards, and we sort of live for each other for the sake of the world. And this kind of community, that's why this is attractive, because we were created for these kinds of relationships. And so when we rub shoulders with people who are far from Jesus, and they see that, they want that, because they were created for it. And so this is how we as a body live out the mission to be Christ's witnesses in the world. Let me pray for us.